The first account from the emperor, dated from the Berezina, brought the distressing particulars of the retreat. Those that were given in the bulletins, and especially in the 29th, could not be read without horror. It was not surprising that many persons should have been deluded by the austere energy that had presided over their composition, and should even feel some indignation at it, accustomed for so long a period to nothing but triumph. The particulars of our defeat, accompanied by so much calamity, spread consternation all over France. The enemies of the emperor grew more numerous, and skillfully made use of the circumstance to raise an outcry against his tyranny. Just as the agitation of the public mind was at the strongest, his arrival at the Tuileries was suddenly published. He admitted everybody, showed severity towards some, intrepidity in the presence of all. He explained the cause of the misfortune of the campaign, and without seeking to dissemble the faults that had been committed, he boldly claimed the support he wanted to begin the war anew, repel the enemy, and conclude a peace of which he more than anyone felt the absolute necessity. His noble courage in wrestling with misfortune electrified the whole country. 300,000 men were granted. The young came forward with courage, the old with firmness. Within a few months, an army was raised admirably brave, though still uninstructed, and the fields of Lutzen and Bautzen witnessed fresh triumphs. The disasters of the campaign of Moscow had brought Russia and Austria to an understanding and alarmed the powers of the second class. Peace was, however, proposed by the emperor, but they had no longer to treat with the sovereign of the world. He began to feel that after having been conquered by the elements, he would be so by man. Though his last battles had turned out in his favor, he now saw that he might have rivals. Pretensions were brought forward, the most important of which was that he should give up his influence over Germany and abandon that part of the continent to the left bank of the Rhine. If he had consented, he would have abandoned the Confederation, the House of Saxony, and the Kingdom of Westphalia. That is to say, he would have dethroned his brother. He would perhaps have done so one day of his own accord, but he could not bear to be commanded. The emperor felt that a power contested in that way is a fallen power. His proud mind, which never knew how to stop, recoiled at the proposals. The negotiations broke off, and he began the war again without considering the youth and inexperience of his soldiers, or the discontent of his generals-in-chief. He fought like a lion, but like a lion forced into its den. I must, however, acknowledge that he was badly seconded. A short time after that period, some particulars were told to me in confidence, but with so much appearance of truth that I cannot omit mentioning them here. The Cossacks were a new engine which made the war perilous, especially to the officers who went out to reconnoiter. Several of them, and particularly those of the general staff, who were chosen indiscriminately by the major general, preferring to give us reports taken from peasants, to exposing themselves at a distance to the attacks of the Cossacks. By this means, the emperor could no longer ascertain the truth. The reports he received were all satisfactory because they were not true. He thought himself able to resist because he entertained a false idea of the strength of the enemy. He commenced the Battle of Leipzig in the full persuasion that the enemy's forces were but half as numerous as they were. He lost the battle, and that defeat completely disorganized his army. His new retreat was more disastrous still than when he came from Russia. The army still, however, made one effort at Hanau. A German who owed the first foundation of his fortune to the emperor, whose praises constitute all his glory, dared to resist him at Hanau, after having abused the confidence of his sovereign and forced him to abandon his allies. But the troops he commanded were destroyed. This was the last struggle of Antiochus in the arms of Hercules. A month later, when he had again set his foot on the land of his birth, his strength returned, and if he was finally leveled to the ground, it was only when treason joined its efforts to those of violence. The army returned in the most grievous disorder. The sick and wounded were innumerable. There were neither hospitals nor private houses sufficient to contain them all. And the most destructive of all diseases, the typhus, attacked not only the army, but all the towns and villages through which the troops passed. The emperor returned for the second time to Paris on the 10th or 11th of November. The attachment of the French for him was so great that on all sides nothing was heard but cries of grief. And if here and there some insults were uttered, they must be laid to the account of the emigrants who began to foresee his fall and the return of the Bourbons. He remained about 6 weeks in Paris. I think I've already said in these memoirs that whenever he was unfortunate, he turned to me. I must not be proud of that circumstance. My attachment to his person was a duty. My antipathy to ambition and intrigue was natural to me. A habit of reflection made me, in general, consider affairs in their true light, and as I was very conveniently placed for observing them in their ensemble, I gave him my opinion with a frankness and sincerity to which the ear of sovereigns is but little accustomed. At my arrival, he commanded me to come every evening into the bathroom next to his bedchamber. He then had me called into him. While he warmed himself, undressed before the fire, we talked familiarly together for an hour before he went to bed. The first evening, I found him so cast down, so overwhelmed, that I was frightened. I went to see his secretary, who is my friend. I communicated to him my fears that his mind, formerly so strong, had begun to sink. "You need not fear," he replied. "He has lost nothing of his energy, but in the evening you see him quite bent down with fatigue. He goes to bed at 11 o'clock, but he is up at 3 o'clock in the morning until night. Every moment is devoted to business. It is time to put an end to this, for he must sink under it, and I shall fall before him." The principal subject of our conversation was the situation of France. I used to tell him with a degree of frankness, the truth of which could alone make him pardon its rudeness, that France was fatigued to an excess, that it was quite impossible for her to bear much longer the burthen with which she was loaded, and that she would undoubtedly throw off the yoke, and according to custom seek an alleviation to her sufferings in novelty, her favorite divinity. I said in particular a great deal of the Bourbons, who, I observed, would finally inherit his royal spoil if ever fortune laid him low. The mention of the Bourbon made him thoughtful, and he threw himself on his bed without uttering a word. But after a few minutes, having approached to know whether I might retire, I saw that he had fallen into a profound sleep. He was then busy with the organization of the National Guards of Paris. The choice of the commanders was a very important point. He spoke frequently with me about that organization. I wished it to be as military as possible. It appeared to me of very great consequence to compose it of ancient warriors who, having their homes and the national glory to defend, would electrify the citizens and easily find in the ardent youth of the metropolis an army of brave men sufficient at least to repel the enemy from their walls. I could not draw from him a single observation on the point, notwithstanding the warmth with which I spoke. The list of the superior officers was at last presented. I do not now recollect by whom, but the very day of the presentation, the prefect came to pay me a visit to acquaint me that I stood on the list as commander of a division. In the evening, I went to the emperor, according to custom. Marshal Berthier came there, and the emperor said to him in my presence, "Do you know whom I have appointed as colonel of the National Guards?" He then read over his list, and instead of my name, I heard that of Jalbert, governor of the Bank of France. Berthier thought the choice was very good, and I was not surprised at it, As for me, I was angry at the circumstance, though there was nothing but blows to be gained, and I left the room. The following day after Mass, I stood at the audience next to Jalbert. He was a councillor of state, formerly a barrister at Bordeaux, an honorable and clever man, but who never had anything to do with the army, and who was besides rather a little ridiculous as a military man on account of his figure and his habits of life. The emperor went up to him, and he thanked him respectfully for the new dignity with which he had been invested. The emperor smiled and said with that joking air so severe in a sovereign, "You never rode on horseback, I believe." "I beg your pardon, sire." "Oh, yes, I suppose you rode on a pony from Bordeaux to Tonnelle." And then he passed on to another. Poor Jalbert, nevertheless, loaded his 2 shoulders with the marks of his rank, but he never showed himself more worthy of a lawyer's cloak than the day the enemy attacked the capital. This singular composition of the staff of the National Guards was explained by the still more singular form of the Parisian fortifications. Plain palisadoes surrounded, ridiculously enough, the barriers of the city. They were barely sufficient to stop a few straggling Cossacks who might intrude so far. He did not wish to frighten the Parisians and draw them from their amusements by an appearance of formidable fortifications and by a warlike composition of the National Guards. He undoubtedly thought that if he had proved unable to beat the enemy, it would be useless to try to defend a city that presented so few means of resistance and so many resources for rebellion. Before he set off, he assembled at the Tuileries all the officers of the National Guards, and taking his son into his arms, he presented him to the assembly and made a speech that electrified every heart. The cries of "Long live the Emperor" were so energetic and so unanimous that I was persuaded for some time that a feeling expressed with so much enthusiasm might perhaps produce some fine result. A little reflection, however, recalled the dismal truth that penetrated my soul. I saw the emperor again in the evening. He spoke to me of what had happened in the morning. I told him freely that the disposition of the public mind would remain good as long as the enemy should not come near Paris, but that it ought not to be put to the test if the enemy approached. He smiled, and pulling me by the ear, according to his custom, he said, "You old Roman, you have no illusions." "No, sire," I replied, "but I rest great hopes on this campaign, and a fine victory will do more good than all this morning's enthusiasm." "Ah," said he, getting into bed, "it must be gained." I remained that night at the Tuileries. He started at 4 o'clock in the morning. He appeared cheerful, firm, and in perfect good health. I had always seen him so when departing, and the state of his mind inspired me with fresh confidence. General Sebastiani returned from the army and remained 2 days at Paris. He gave me sad particulars of the campaign. The enemies were so numerous, the disasters so great, the country so horribly ravaged, that it appeared difficult for the emperor to hold out much longer. He soon felt, after the observations I made, how dangerous it would be to make known his alarms, which he had already in some way propagated, and wishing to neutralize their effect, he mentioned the necessity of defending Paris as the only means of saving France. Furious complaints and sarcasms arose against him in Talleyrand's circle and among all the high nobility, who already were in correspondence with the Count d'Artois. He left the capital, hooted by the emigrants, and if he told the emperor all he really thought, I cannot but think that it was upon his report that the emperor commanded the minister of police to arrest Prince Talleyrand and send him far from the metropolis. While the emperor, opposed by all the armies of Europe, was struggling like a lion, running from one to another, thwarting all the maneuvers of the enemy by the rapidity of his movements, deceiving them in all their calculations, and exhausting them with fatigue, other foes much more dangerous than they were in Paris, entering into a secret league with foreigners to hasten his fall. Monsieur de Talleyrand, whom they had chosen for their leader, did not, however, second their hostile measures as much as their impatience required. The great name of Napoleon, 15 years of brilliant victories, the inexhaustible resources of his genius, his unconquerable vigor of mind, the still existing possibility of a peace in the midst of battle. Finally, the sentiments of France, who still wished well to the emperor. All these circumstances rendered the greatest prudence necessary. Besides, what had he to expect from the Bourbons? Could they have forgotten that his conduct had been ever hostile towards them for the last 25 years? Director of the Constituent Assembly, Minister of the Directory, and Napoleon, a married priest. How could he find grace in their eyes? On the other hand, if France finally triumphed over so many enemies, what would he not have to fear from an irritated conqueror who could not but be acquainted with his treasonable conduct? Was he destined to end far from his country and in exile? The last days of an infirm and disgraced old age? He therefore did his utmost to keep his friends in bounds, and that he might not be crushed by the violent measures of the boisterous minister of police. His ingenuity and skill were exercised to throw trouble and perplexity in the way of the Duc de Rovigo, Savary. It was he who, according to the public report, had presided at the execution of the Duc d'Enghien. He had not striven to hide the particulars of it, which had been exaggerated, and nothing could equal the hatreds the royalists bore him. He had a numerous family, and his fortune was not sufficient for him to do without the salary he drew from the government. How could he, besides, preserve his rank or even his tranquility under the reign of the Bourbons? Monsieur de Talleyrand, after having presented him with a faithful picture of what his situation would be in case the emperor should fall, an event which appeared scarcely to be avoided, applauded his fidelity and devotion, but advised him not to shut out from himself all possibility of pardon or even favor at the hands of Louis XVIII by taking measures of rigor and violence against the royalists, the consequences of which might be fatal even to the emperor himself, as they might occasion disturbance in the capital, which the police would not be able to suppress. The minister was most certainly shaken. The Messieurs Polignac, who had been confined since the affair of Georges, first in a state prison and then in a maison de santé, sanitarium, escaped about that time, after having given a thorough beating to the police inspector who was to have transferred them to a prison a considerable distance from Paris. The Duchess of Rovigo was their relative, and a few days after the entrance of the Count d'Artois, the Duke told me that the Messieurs Polignac had just been with him and had requested him to publish in print that it was to him they owed their liberty. He waived the proposal, but it was easy to judge that he was not sorry the Count should believe the truth of the anecdote. After the Battle of Montereau, the Emperor had given the Duc de Rovigo Savary an order to send Monsieur de Talleyrand from Paris, with a positive injunction to cut off all communications between him and his friends in the metropolis. I was in the Duke's closet when he opened the dispatch, which grieved him extremely. "What is the Emperor thinking of?" he said. "Have not I enough to do to keep in awe all the royalists in France? Does he want to throw another Faubourg Saint-Germain on my shoulders? Talleyrand alone is able to keep them at peace and prevent them from taking some foolish step. I shall not execute that order, and by the emperor will thank me for it." The measure would nevertheless have been very wise. The royalists would have been without leaders, and the enemy without directors or encouragement. They would perhaps have dared to venture their march upon Paris, which proved so fatal to the emperor. Marmont would not have signed the truce of the 30th of March, and Napoleon would have gained the 12 hours he wanted to enable him to reach the capital. That deplorable prepossession of the Duc de Rovigo, Savary, who nevertheless remained faithful, was not the only cause of our misfortunes. All persons attached to government soon shared the same feeling. All had fallen into dismay and discouragement, and with the exception of Boulet de la Meurthe, T. Paudeau, and some other retainers of the revolution familiar with political disturbances, who had nothing to expect and everything to fear from the Bourbons. All the others were only intent on saving some part of the wreck for themselves. The emperor had appointed his brother Joseph, lieutenant general of Paris. That prince, though a man of amiable mind and extended information, wanted energy. He could neither persuade the council nor excite the people, who were only waiting for a leader. To say the truth, he was distinguished by nothing but his obsolete title of King of Spain, and the Peninsular War had cost too much blood for any gratitude or confidence to attach to the person for whose profit it was undertaken. The Arch-Chancellor Cambacérès, a learned lawyer, but a stranger more by character than even by the habits of his life to those energetic resolutions which great dangers require, could do nothing but submit to the common fate. The Duc de Feltre, Minister of the War Department, a good secretary, but a man of narrow mind, and the slave of his vanity, which stuck to everything, served the emperor with suspicious carelessness, and dreamed already of the prodigious honor he would acquire by being a minister of the Bourbons. A council at which the empress presided was held at the moment the enemy entered Nancy, while pursuing Marshals Ragusa and Treviso. The empress requested that a resolution might be taken in regard to herself and her son, for she relied no longer on her father, and no accounts had arrived for several days from the emperor. None but generous advice ought to have been given to her. Boulet de la Meurthe took the task upon himself in recalling to her memory the conduct of her grandmother, Maria Theresa, in presence of the Hungarians. He said, "Madame, go to the Hôtel de Ville. Cross the streets of Paris with your son in your arms. The whole capital will accompany you to the advanced posts. Acquaint the allied sovereigns with your resolution to remain in Paris, surrounded by your faithful subjects, to share their dangers, and to descend only by force from the throne, on which you seated yourself amidst the applause of those very nations and kings who now besiege you."